Welcome to season 2 of In the Wake of Hate, Stories of Survival. I am Sandra West, and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Ruskin. This season, we're going to be interviewing other second-generation Holocaust survivors. And today, our first guest for the season is Sandra Kessler. So I'm going to start just by asking Michael to give a quick recap of why we're here for anybody that hasn't watched the show before. And then hopefully we can have a fun conversation and share some common interests and common experiences.
Great. Okay, well, I want to welcome our audience to our channel. Sandra and I are very excited to have you here, and of course, we're excited to have Sandra here. To give you a quick background on who I am, if you haven't watched our previous episodes, I am from Brooklyn, New York. My parents are Holocaust survivors from the country of Lithuania. Where nearly 97% of the local Jewish population were exterminated by the Germans and their collaborators. So I don't want to go too far into it, but I was actually born in Brooklyn, New York. My parents left Munich, Germany in 1948, and we arrived in Ellis Island, and I grew up in Brooklyn and then moved to New Jersey. To quickly give you a rundown, I am the last surviving member of my family, and my brother, who passed away about 10 years ago, which left me in a situation where I wanted to talk about my parents' experiences, which I found out through documents that I found in my father's condominium after he passed away, and those documents were used by the attorneys and the doctors for the German government for reparations for the loss of my sister, who died in March of 1944 in the Kovna ghetto in Lithuania, and my grandparents, aunts, and uncles. As I said, I'm the last surviving member of my family. So I started my book, and I got involved in making presentations. And interestingly enough, one of the first questions I always get from my audience is, what was it like to be raised by parents who were Holocaust survivors? And I was kind of taken back. I thought they'd be talking about my parents. They were more interested in what happened to me as a child. And Sandra and I came up with the idea that why don't we get children, the second generation, to come on our channel, and let's just talk about what was it like to be raised by Holocaust survivors. And that's exactly what we did. And now we have this channel, and we're very excited to bring on many guests who will talk about themselves as well as the experience of their parents and grandparents. So that's why we're here. So Sandra, being our first guest, we're very excited to have you with us. So why don't we start off by just asking you, your parents came from what country?
So my mother came from central Poland near Lodz.
Yep.
And my father, who, just got out right in time, he was the only member of his family that his older brother, who was already in the United States, could get a visa for. So for the entire family on both my uncles and my aunts, his wife's side, my father got the brass ring, and so he came here in 838, and he was from a town that was then Poland but is now in Belarus.
Right. So they had to be sponsored, right? They couldn't get into this country unless they had a sponsor.
Correct.
Right.
Well, that's my father's story. So, basically I have no relatives left on my father's side. Either, they were lost.
So you said your dad came here in 38.
Right.
And your mom, were they already married or?
No. So my mother, her family was from a town in central Poland called Jędrzejwola. They were socialist Bundists, so they thought they could stay in place in Poland and live a Jewish life. They weren't particularly religious, but they were, when September 1939 happened, and it was all very quick. They were ghettoized in their hometown. My mother was 17. Her younger sister, there were 5 siblings. Her younger sister was 14. The two of them were sent soon. I'm not exactly sure how long they were ghettoized in their town, but then they were sent to the Lodz ghetto. And they had a much, the eldest sister actually had already gone west with an aunt and uncle who were the ones eventually who were able to sponsor my mother and my aunt. And then a younger brother in between who went east and wound up spending the war in Siberia. And then finally, they had a younger brother who, along with the parents and everyone in that generation, was liquidated right away. So it was my mother and my aunt who basically went through what I refer to as the whole 9 yards of the Holocaust, from the Lodz ghetto, where they were slave labor, to Auschwitz, where they were lucky enough to be selected by Mengele. Although to hear both my mother's version and my aunt's version, and they're both passed on now. Everyone in that generation is gone. Every Holocaust survivor, and I grew up entirely surrounded by Holocaust survivors. I thought when I was little, I thought everybody's parents had been in a concentration camp. That was what it was like. I learned otherwise, but so yeah, and then they were sent to a munitions factory near Berlin, working as slave labor. I think it was either Krupp or IG Farben. I'm not sure. When Berlin was about to fall, they were then the Jewish women. They worked alongside Aryan women. So they were kept a little cleaner, a little better fed, so there'd be no disease or anything like that. But when, things were getting really bad for the Germans, with the Russians coming into Berlin, they sent the Jewish women to Ravensbrück, which was originally the women's political camp. And they basically dumped them there. No food, no water, no nothing. Dead and dying bodies all around.
Hey, Sandra, let me just ask you a few fast questions. So your mom and dad came here in the late 30s.
No, my mother did not get here till after the Holocaust. My father managed to get here just before the war. My mother, along with her younger sister, my Aunt Sylvia, they went through the whole thing and were eventually liberated by the Swedish Red Cross out of Ravensbrück, taken to Sweden. So we're ready. We're in April 1945.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. My mother would tell me that they were liberated on Hitler's birthday or the day Hitler died. I never, she could be a little vague, but they were taken to Sweden. They were rehabilitated. The Swedish Red Cross put ads with the names of the women that they, had rescued, liberated, in all the Jewish newspapers all over the place, and they found my mother's, my mother and her sister's aunt, who had already managed to get to New York via Casablanca. So, it's like the wandering Jews.
So how did you gain all this information? Did your parents tell you these stories, or how did you find out about their backgrounds?
Interestingly enough, my mother never stopped talking about it.
Did they speak Yiddish?
Yes.
So did you speak Yiddish?
No, they did not want me and my older sister to speak Yiddish. They wanted us to be Americans.
Well, my parents spoke to me in Yiddish, and I spoke Yiddish until I was around 7 years old. I didn't speak English until I got into the second grade.
Yeah, no, they refused to speak. They spoke Yiddish to each other.
Right.
So, I was able to, understand some stuff. They spoke Yiddish when they were with, their Holocaust survivor community. But my sister and my sister's a little older than me, we were at 100% English. They literally did not want us. They never spoke to us in Yiddish. Never.
Did your
So
mother bring up these stories by herself, or were you asking her questions when you were a child?
my mother told me these stories by herself. She never held back. She never held back. And it was pretty, it was not exactly the best things for a young child to
Right.
be hearing. I knew before anybody else I knew what, humans were capable of doing to other humans. And one of the things, and I always say if and when I write my memoirs, and I guess I should get started because I'm getting up there. The title of my memoir will be If I Knew You Were Going to Be This Bad, I Wouldn't Have Survived Hitler.
Mhm.
That is my earliest conscious memory. I must have been around 3. Fussy toddler. I always had eating issues. My mother was obsessed with food. And I kind of, have this visual memory of being sitting at the little table in the kitchen and fussing over breakfast. So I wasn't in school yet. I think my sister must have been already. And I remember her spitting this out to me, looking just so angry and annoyed and saying, if I knew you were going to be this bad, I wouldn't have survived Hitler.
How old were you at the time she started telling you these stories?
Well, like I said, my earliest conscious memory of her saying that to me, I was about 3.
Wow.
And I just remember hearing all the stories. And as I got older, I was the kind of kid who just always wanted the details. So, yes, I did ask her to repeat the stories to give me more detail. And then when I was old enough, like junior high school age, I started to do my own research into what it was all about.
Do you remember sitting with your folks and watching TV, World at War, or any kind of documentaries, and they showed about what happened during the war on TV? It was called World at War. They would have these documentaries every week, and they would talk about what happened during World War II. A lot of it was about the concentration camps.
Yeah, I remember seeing those much later on like PBS.
Yeah.
And there was a series narrated by Laurence Olivier.
Yep. Yep.
But I don't remember seeing that until I was quite a bit older.
Okay.
At least a teenager.
So, did your parents, their friends, were they mostly Jewish people, or were they assimilating? They had Christian friends and Jewish friends, and I mean, how conservative were they as Jews? Were they conservative?
Oh yeah, that's a very difficult question. First of all, yes, they only, what's the word? Their friends, their community was only Jews. And pretty much their friends, except for like one friend that my mother had, when I was a child, when we lived. I also, by the way, grew up. I was born in the Bronx, but I grew up in Brooklyn,
Mm-hmm.
first Brownsville, then East Flatbush. And my mother did have one friend who was Jewish, but not a Holocaust survivor. But every other adult that I knew of was a Holocaust survivor.
Got it.
That, they were not sociable people. Conservative versus liberal doesn't really apply in their case. They were insular. Especially when we moved to East Flatbush, and I was from first grade through high school. The neighborhood was largely a secular, working class, lower middle class Jewish neighborhood. So mostly everybody around us was Jewish, except for the girl next door who I wound up being friends with for a few years, who was Irish and French Catholic, and who my mother, warned me that someday she might call me a dirty Jew, and I hate to say it, but she did. And that was the end of the friendship. But everybody else around me was pretty much Jewish. By the time I got into junior high school, they were more Italians, but we were good friends with them, Italian girls. Yeah, the thing with my family is we were very insular. We didn't go places, we didn't see things, we didn't travel, we didn't belong. That was like the one thing that when I look back that sets me apart from so many other Jews, and especially the Zionists that I am, is that we never belonged to anything. I had one friend whose family went to the local, sort of fancy conservative synagogue in the neighborhood. And and so I used to hang out with her for the high holy days and stuff. Her mother kept kosher because of her father, who was from the old country. But other than that, it was pretty much secular all the way. And when I did ask my mother at one point, how come we don't belong to a synagogue? Her only answer to me was, costs too much. We can't afford it.
Right.
That was it. That was the end of the conversation.
Well, when I was very small, my parents would say to me before I'd go out to play, no one in the neighborhood needs to know we're Jews. It's none of their business. They say,
Oh.
don't tell anybody we're refugees. That's what they kept saying to me before I would go out and play. They did not have a lot of non-Jewish friends. They didn't really have many friends, period. As with your family, they kept to themselves a lot. But they were always a little bit suspicious if you were not Jewish, as if that behind your back they really didn't like you because you were Jews.
Can I ask what Jewish neighborhood you grew up with? I mean, what neighborhood in Brooklyn you grew up in?
I was born in Borough Park,
Okay.
and that was pretty conservative Jewish background. My grandfather was a rabbi.
Ah.
So I come from a really conservative background, but yet as I grew up, I didn't really care what your faith was. I mean, if you were a good person, fun to be with, that didn't make any difference to me.
Well, that's true of how I grew up. Yeah, that's true of how I grew up. It just happened that in my neighborhood I was surrounded by Jews, and mostly secular. Like I said, there was before we had to move out of the neighborhood when I graduated from high school. Some Hasidic Jews started to move in, and that was not us.
Right,
Totally not us. But no, my mother did not. Like I said, I had this one friend. She lived next door. She was a little older than me. She was a year older than me. And she went to Catholic school, and I went to public school. But I skipped a grade from second to fourth. So we were now sort of peers in the same grade. But I was always a small person,
right,
stature wise, petite. So she kind of took me under her wing. She was poor. Her mother and father were separated, which is a no-no in the Catholic, especially then, Catholic community. They lived in a basement apartment in a three-story house next door, and we were poor. We had nothing really, the basics, and that was
me
it.
too, me too.
Um, my father became disabled quite early when after because he was in the US Army during World War II, and apparently he had a heart defect that they hadn't realized at the time, and the experience wound up making it worse. So it was a bit of a paranoid home, although they never railed against Christians as in a strange way. And I kind of grew up watching television because that's how I learned to speak English well. I grew up watching old movies,
Yeah,
and I love Christmas movies. I grew up watching, all those Bing Crosby as a priest movies, and thinking, isn't it nice to believe in something?
Yeah.
And we didn't.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. You were very young when you started doing your own research on your parents' background, right? When you were a teenager?
Yeah, not so much my parents' background, because I didn't know how to do that. I learned about their background from them, but I was always inclined toward history, history, politics. I was a pretty precocious kid. And I was always the kind of kid who, if someone said something to me, I'd go, why do you think that? Or where did you hear that? I was always noticing things, always questioning things. So I was naturally inclined to learn more. And yeah, I started reading whatever I could, watching, again, I would watch the old movies and stuff. So there were, certain ones that were on TV, and I just sort of, autodidact, I guess. I was one of those kids who did extremely well in school. It was where I got most of my, school was the one place where I kind of felt like people understood me and cared about me, and because I didn't feel that at home. We had very weird relationships with
What
both my sister and I, weird relationships with our parents.
can you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by weird?
Okay, what do I mean by weird? So before COVID came in, I actually participated in a 2G group that had met about once a month for about a year with a research psychologist, Irit Felsen, who is originally from Israel. She herself is a 2G, but she was on like the youngest end of that, and grew up in Israel. So it's a very different attitude, as I later learned from friends about the Holocaust. And we learned all sorts of, we the group, and it was mostly women. There were like two men, and they didn't come all the time, which I thought was interesting. But there were about 10 of us, maybe a dozen of us, who, like, looked at different issues about growing up with Holocaust survivor parents. And one of the things that I learned from Irit was the term intersubjectivity. So, her field is trauma, and especially, and she works with people who come from trauma backgrounds,
Mhm.
but specializes in Holocaust survivors and their children. And when I learned what that term was, it sort of, a light went off on me. So how she described it is that intersubjectivity, and she's talking specifically about what goes on between parent and child. It's when a person cannot, or the level of intersubjectivity is either it goes from, I mean, the basic thing is a parent who can separate themselves from their child, understanding that their child is a separate person. And that's a high level of intersubjectivity. Parents who have a low level of it cannot distinguish themselves from their children. So you are an extension of your parent.
Right.
So that was my situation with my
Yeah.
mother.
Yeah.
I never felt that she could accept me as a separate person with ideas of my own, with feelings of my own, with desires of my own. And of course, the older I got, the more difficult it got. And she also came, from a culture, a lot of the Holocaust survivor children that I met in this group, their parents came from like Vienna, and other places where their parents were already like very cultured,
Yep. Yep.
and they passed down this culture to their children, and had a more, I guess you'd call it, liberal viewpoint about what they expect of their children. Whereas my parents came, and it was mostly my mother. My father was out of the picture a lot because he was ill.
Mm.
So it was mostly my mother, and she came from a culture where girls were not supposed to have basically achievements of their own. They're supposed to marry well, someone with a business, someone who could keep them, at a much better level than she could give to her daughters. And that if we showed, and she said this to me numerous times as I was growing up, don't show the boys how smart you are. You'll never get a husband.
Mm-hmm.
So, and her only sort of idea of what was like professionally, an accepted ambition was to be a public school teacher who got your summers off so you could take maternity leave and raise your kids and then go back to work. And my brain was so far beyond that way of thinking. Even as a child, it's like I could hear like the disconnect between what she was saying to me about what she expected of her daughters. And my sister was even more, she was the outwardly rebellious one. I was the internally rebellious, but not outwardly. And on the other hand, I also grew up with a father who was badly, disabled because of his heart, in and out of the hospital. Things I learned much later was that some of it had to do with nervous breakdowns and stuff. But I, could see that I didn't have, like my mother didn't have a husband, I didn't have a father that could be counted on to
Right.
ensure that I would have this lovely life as the wife of some business owner, as well as the fact that it just didn't appeal to me. So to me, there was always these disconnects between what she was saying, what she expected of me, and what was going on internally in my brain, emotionally, and whatever. And frankly, it led to a lot of weird stuff with me going on physically and mentally. I was sick a lot, but never with anything that was so serious. It was always these subclinical things.
So tell me what happened later. I assume you got married eventually, right?
Yes,
And you married a
I
Jewish man?
I did, and we're still married. It's been 42 years since we met and married, and he's from what's called the red diaper generation. The kids whose grandparents came over during, around the time of the first failed Russian Revolution, the late 18, from the late 1800s through 1920. And they were communists, socialists slash communists. And his peers were referred to as red diaper babies because they grew up um, in that atmosphere of communism and atheism that was expressed as hostility toward religious observance of any kind, but especially toward observant Jews. And while I was never observant, but I feel very fiercely Jewish, it's become an issue.
Mm-hmm. Your parents' behavior towards you affect the way you raised your children?
I don't have children. That's why I don't.
So did you at one point did you want children when you got married?
Theoretically, yeah, because I've always had a big nurturing streak. And I've always loved, oddly, I actually at one point did want to be a teacher because I really love that kind of engagement with
Yeah.
people. But once I got married and my husband's parents, he lost his father at a young age. I lost my father. His mother's side of the family I could see there was like some mental illness there. And I felt I had no support structure. I couldn't just have a child and then stay home. I would go nuts. I was already moving up in what was then my career, and my husband was teaching, and we couldn't raise a family on just his salary. I'm
Hmm.
not the kind of person even back then, I just didn't feel like I wanted to raise my child in childcare. So, and knowing I had I did not have a mother who I would want to trust, being my backup for helping to raise a child. I was afraid of what she would deliver to them because of what she delivered to me, as well as my sister. And so, yeah, I just chose not to have children.
Sandra, you were raised in a place where religion was not a big factor growing up.
Yes, not observant religion. Being Jewish was important, but not,
Yeah.
yeah, but not the practice, not the observance.
Could you have married outside of your faith?
I suppose I could have. In fact, before I met my husband, I actually dated someone who was a Chicano from Texas who'd gone to MIT. And he actually, all of his roommates at MIT were Jews. He knew more Yiddish than I did. And and he really, I was in a really bad relationship situation at the time. And I think he would have wanted to marry me and probably raise children Jewish. So, yeah. Um, he
But
might even have converted. I don't know. But so that's interesting. It was more like his attitude was really very positive and stuff, but just wasn't meant to be.
So most of your friends growing up were Jewish though,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. But secular Jewish.
Right, right. Okay. And obviously, you really didn't know anything about your grandparents either on both sides of your family. Your grandparents on your father or mother's side. They didn't. They talk about their families.
No, my father did not. I know nothing about my grandparents on his side. On my mother's side, I did learn something. One, that they were Socialist Bund, and that my grandfather was actually a leader of the local Socialist Bund. He was president of the local chapter, or whatever they called it, director of the local chapter of Ort, which, if you know what that is, comes out of the Bund, and it was for specifically teaching young women a trade so that they could support themselves if they needed to, help support their families, with a trade. And I know when here in the United States, that was the workman's circle, and there was Ort here. But again, once my parents, especially my mother, was here, we joined nothing, we were affiliated with nothing, we had ties to nothing but other Holocaust survivors.
Your mother, your mother was a woman who expected you to follow her rules and her rules and the way she wanted you to grow up. Correct?
I wouldn't exactly call them rules. She was dictatorial in that sense.
So, I mean, if you did something that displeased her, did she ever respond by being very cold to you?
No, never cold. More like yelling and screaming. It wasn't cold. No, she was. We There was a lot of yelling and screaming in my household.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of I'm seeing a lot of similarities and a lot of differences here because I know Michael's personal story very well, and it's interesting to me how there are some very big differences, but then there are also some similarities that
Yeah.
are very close. I know I saw Michael's face and I knew it aligned in talking about the expectations and not feeling like an individual person and not feeling like you could, be yourself. And that's something that I know was a big deal for him. And then to see how, you guys had that same experience, but with very different parenting styles, with
Yeah,
your parents, Sandra, being very open with you and your mom particularly sharing everything with you. And in Michael's case, it was always just very vague. There was an awareness, but not really the detail. So it's really interesting to see the similarities and the contrast there.
yeah. That was actually another thing I learned when I participated in this 2G roundtable, is how we had so many similarities, but also so many differences. Again, coming down mostly to parenting style. And as we learned about each other, I realized that my mother's parenting style was, she was more of the histrionic type. And she was also very low in intersubjectivity. So she couldn't separate her and me. So her anger, rage, bitterness, and that's how I will describe how she always was, would be directed. And I learned that there were a lot of 2Gs who had much better parenting experiences than I did. They revered, especially ones with fathers who were open, they kind of revered them. But I also learned I wasn't the one who had the worst situation. There was one woman especially who was so mistreated by her father, who was a survivor and who lost his first family in the Holocaust. See, mine were young, so they didn't have like that background of having had a family taken, their own kids and wives and husbands taken from them. So in that way, it was a little easier for them. But this particular woman who was raised in England, her father so badly mistreated her, she never lived up to the standard that he had been expecting because of his first family. So I felt really, I really wanted to hug her, but that never happened. We were also physically, I also noticed we didn't make friendships among the 2Gs. I
Hmm.
have one 2G friend with whom I'm still very close, although she was brought up Orthodox, and she's the one I actually learned about Judaism from. She had a PhD in all but final dissertation from Columbia in Russian Jewish studies. So, but
My,
other than that, there was no interest in forming friendships.
hmm.
And I don't know if that's a 2G thing. I really don't.
my mother, my mother was very shut down emotionally if I didn't do what she told me. So I had to acquiesce and become more like the little Jewish boy she wanted me to be, where I was more just being who I was. And then, that what happens from there is you become a people pleaser, trying for you to get on her good side. You would do things you normally wouldn't do, but of course you want your mother's love, so you do it because you wanted their love. And it betrayed who I really was. So it was a really situation for me. I was torn between one side and the other.
Yeah, and I know that, in some ways I was like that, but in other ways I don't know whether it's simply, I do believe that certain personality aspects are you're born with. And I was always kind of resisting have, what, giving in to the expectations. But I also became very self-sufficient. I learned to be very self-sufficient. But I did carry over some of that into later, relationships where the long-term boyfriend I had before I met, which ended a couple of years before I even met my husband. And he was sort of like how you're describing your mother. He was someone who also came from he came from an American but broken Jewish home. And he would go cold on me. And, I felt like it was my job to do the things that would make him love me, but nothing I could do would ever result in that. Meanwhile, I did start because I had so many physical ailments as a result of, there's a lot of study of the epigenetics of inherited trauma. And I know these things are quite common with two G's, but you name it, I had it. I had, sort of cycling. I had OCD, and I can tell you it's when I was 6, I remember having OCD. Of course, it took me to my 40s to find out what it was. So I had OCD, I had anxiety and panic,
Yep.
I had periodic depression. Most of my emotions went into the pit of my stomach. I had eating problems. I had swallowing, not just eating problems, but swallowing problems.
Yeah.
I went through periodic months and months at a time when I was a kid, not being able to swallow and hiding it. I got really good at hiding it. And it wasn't until, much later that, and yet I excelled at school, straight A student, all sorts of accolades and honors. But by the time I got to college, and we had been more or less forced to move from where I grew up in Brooklyn all the way to the Bronx after a couple of years after my father passed away, because that's where my mother's younger sister lived with her family. So I went there at the start of college, and I guess it all sort of all of that stuff came together in me. And I spent 3 of those years being so beyond miserable. And then my mother got cancer in the middle of it, and I had to take care of her because my sister had been out of the house already. And so finally, I recognized that I better find some kind of therapy or I'm not going to get through that.
Yeah.
And so, all of the things that I've done to sort of deal with all of this in my life have been self-directed. So, which I'm very proud, I'm proud of the fact that that's true of me, that I have been self-directed. But I did find, the NYU Graduate School of Psychology. As a student, I was able to, get a minimal, get a PhD student who was, didn't cost me much of anything. And let me tell you, it put me on the road to sanity, but it took many, many years of further work.
What I find really interesting here is the fact that Sandra is very independent the way I am. And a lot of that comes from our mothering. We had to learn to depend on ourselves to be happy and find the answers. That's what we have in common. And so, because we had no choice, we had to find ourselves, and our parents, because they didn't give us the kind of, I don't know, the kind of nurturing you would normally get, we had to find it within ourselves. And that's why both of us are so independent. We blazed our own trail.
Yeah, that's true. And yet, my sister is an example of someone who didn't learn, although she started out, she was the independent one. She's the one who started out traveling when she was, 16, going places. She got herself out of Brooklyn College and into Barnard. Um, and I was afraid of things. I was afraid of other people. I was afraid of
Yeah.
things. I was afraid physically. And over the decades, it's like we totally reversed our personality, our personalities. What I learned in my therapy, we both wound up early in therapy for a long time. What I learned in my therapy is to stop blaming. It's like my mother is my mother. She couldn't be any other way. And that you can't change the past. You have to come to terms with it. That it's you have to learn that no, it wasn't your fault that she was like that.
Yeah.
But learn how to negotiate the relationship. I'm not going to like cut my mother off. I need my mother. She is my mother. But I had to like learn to negotiate the relationship. My sister, on the other hand, and we were like always kind of rivals. She was just a little less than 3 years older than me. She was also top of her class. She was more science oriented. I was more sort of, although we were both in the math science honors program in the same high school, I tended more toward the history and
Yeah.
ideas of things, and she tended more towards physics, although she did wind up getting a PhD in social psychology. But I remember, when I met, she was in therapy for the longest time until her therapist passed away shortly after my sister got married, which was a few years after I got married. And what I was observing from my sister and from having, met her therapist a couple of times, she was taught to be a victim, to feel like a victim. Our mother could have been nicer. We would have these weird conversations when we got together after my mother died. My husband and her husband, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, have dinner, and of course, inevitably, the conversation turned to our childhood. She hated my father, and I still am not quite sure why. Um, but she was constantly saying our mother could have been nicer. And I'd look at her and go, no, she couldn't have been. She was who she was.
Mm-hmm.
And I get the sense, again, my sister's always trying to please people. She's always constantly disappointed when someone like doesn't accept her gift with the expected gratitude, or who says something maybe a little snippy to her and she was hoping for a friendship, and so now that person's off the charts. Whereas I kind of learned that, people are just not going to like me. If they don't like me, that's not my problem.
Yep.
Took me a very long time for that one, after the last 10 years of crazy politics and cancellation and adherence to ideology. I lost so many old friends.
Yep.
But I can't do anything about it.
It's true.
She will not learn that. She always has to blame someone else.
It's unfortunate that she had a therapist that encouraged that. Because I did not have a wonderful childhood. There are actually a lot of similarities in some of the things that you're speaking about, Sandra. And I have also embraced that mentality of, it was what it was, and that wasn't my fault. It wasn't my fault that I was raised that way. It wasn't my fault and I wasn't a bad kid. But now I'm an adult, and now it is my responsibility to figure out how to handle the relationship, how to handle my emotions, how to
Right.
handle myself properly. And I think that's where people get confused, because it's okay to accept that maybe they weren't the best parent and maybe you didn't have the best upbringing. They did the best that they could. You can accept that those things happened. You can accept that you have some of it. But moving forward, if you don't accept that it's your responsibility, then you can't, move forward with your life.
One area I'm interested in, you said you negotiated a lot with your mom, Sandra. I guess the relationship you had with your husband was very similar, right?
Yeah. So yeah, my belief is that we're not all black and white. We don't have and it spills over to politics because I've always been deeply involved in politics and policy and politics. The work I did, number one, it's also my interest. One of my early memories, or my introduction to politics was I like this story. So when my mother became a citizen, she was it was 1956, and it was the presidential election. My sister was in school and I wasn't. So I went with my mother to the local polling place, and I will never forget how proud she says she was that she's now in a country where she can vote for her leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the way you felt that way, especially most Holocaust survivors were Democrats, because Roosevelt and Truman won the war and
Yep.
got them. So I remember that, and I remember in 1960, I was what, 9. We all sat in front of our little black and white TV and watched the Nixon Kennedy debate. So, like, I was always totally like into it and aware of it. And that, kind of led me always in the major lesson I learned from my mother. And yes, one of the early things she would say to me, when I was pretty young, was that although she was so grateful to the United States for bringing her here and allowing her to have a new life, which wasn't the best life, but she said, just don't forget it could happen here. Just stay aware.
Yep.
And I always have. So it is interesting, one of the things being a 2G has given me, or at least someone with the personality I have, is I'm the one who's generally standing on the outside, looking in and surveying the scene. And I guess one of the abilities I have always had is I can see both the trees and the forest. I can switch my focus as I need to focus in on the particulars, but then stand back and then look at the whole picture.
So you never had any aspirations to run for a public office.
No, I was always too shy, but I did want to be an actress.
Okay.
No, no public office.
It's
No.
almost the same.
Well, there is a lot of overlap, isn't there? But yeah, when I was in, junior high, when I was little, up until college, I really wanted to be an actress and a singer. I had a really good singing voice, which sadly has been destroyed. And I did do like 10 years of community theater before, I got married. And then it just became too much. I didn't have the time. I was getting a little older
Yep.
and the egos were annoying me. So
Yeah.
I was told I was good. I did those, signature musical comedy roles, the soprano roles. So,
That's interesting. Well, you were in New York. I mean, that's the place to be for that.
well, that's part of it, and
Yeah.
it's just something that always, like, even when I was before I could remember it, and this is stories my mother, I remember, told me about myself, is that she said one time, they were sitting with their folding chairs outside. This was in Brownsville, outside the building, and she turned around and, like, she didn't see me, and so there the posse of mothers all went off to find me, and I was just turned around. It turned out I was just around the corner, and I was singing and dancing for another group of mothers who were sitting in their folding chairs in front of the building around the corner. So
You were a born actress.
I know, I'm expressive, and I was good at giving, when I had to give speeches, I was good at that, and I've had my moments. Um,
That's interesting.
yeah, I was also a professional listener, so that's the other side of it.
That's good. Okay.
Well, I appreciate you coming and sharing with us. It's been fantastic getting to hear your story and be able to kind of see those similarities and differences. And I know, one of our biggest goals in this show overall and sharing stories is really to kind of bring things to the forefront and for people to understand that these are not experiences that happened in the past in history books, that it's been a ripple effect that has carried on to people and communities and next generations, and also to further reach the fact that it's not exclusive to Holocaust survivors either. It's something that happens within survived trauma, in lots of families.
Yeah, I remember reading a book for book club about the experiences of a Vietnamese woman whose family experienced this, with the communist regime and escaping that, and I could really identify with what and it was a graphic novel. It was really good. I forget the name of it, but I could really identify with what her family went through. Wasn't, some of the horrors were not that different.
Yep. And to bring that kind of back to what you mentioned, your mother reminding you of the, it could happen here, it could happen again. It's something that I think people need to remember and recognize, and be aware that this isn't just something you learn in history class.
Absolutely. It's something you have to live. And you also have to learn to live not being a victim, but being, as old as I am now, 73, I look forward, and I see where, that's why I'm a Zionist, because I look forward to where the future is. And to me, that's important. And the older I get, the more important it is for me to get those messages out there, and also just to stay aware of what's going on, because I do see it before others do see it, and especially among Jews,
And especially now.
and especially now. That's right.
Hmm.
So
Okay. All right. Well, that may be a good segue to leave us with some food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was going to say next. Is I would like to kind of end with, if there's one single message that you want people to take away from your experience and the things that you have learned and understand now, what would that one piece of advice or information be?
Good point.
I guess it goes back to the the wisdom of Hillel. If I'm not for myself, who am I?
Good for you.
So you absolutely need to realize that the past is the past. You learn from it, but you don't wallow in it. You have to keep going on and look to the future and don't be a victim, but try to be a positive influence on your world now and, you know, and whenever you can be.
I could not agree more.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you both, and thank you to our audience. And we look forward to returning for another episode soon.
Sandra, thank you, Sandra.
Mm.
Take care.
Thank you. You too.